Hi, I'm Jay Phelan. Let's learn some biology. We've been talking about the nervous system and in particular neurons, how these cells work. I want to talk in this video about the synapse. This is where we get some communication between cells, either between a neuron and another neuron or a neuron and a muscle. Our nervous system works by starting with a signal, something that comes from the outside world that initiates an action potential, travels through the dendrites, through the cell body, down the axon. At the end of the axon, it's going to have a synapse with another cell. We're going to look here at what happens there. So here's a picture of the terminal button filled with vesicles that are filled with the neurotransmitter chemicals that are going to have some sort of influence on the postsynaptic cell. Here we have a bunch of muscle cells that are in kind of orange-brown, and every one of them has a motor neuron attached to them. So it's just like electrical wiring. The motor neuron sends the signal that has a synapse with the muscle cell that's going to send a signal, contract, don't contract. We're going to look at what is that signal? What's the nature of the interaction at the synapse? Here's what it looks like. It looks kind of like a shower head. This is a complicated drawing. It's worth learning this because we'll see that the synapse, whether it has to do with visual memory in your brain, thinking about stuff, whether it has to do with causing a muscle to contract, whether it has to do with a pleasure center in your brain, it's the same thing. You've got the terminal button and it's going to have an interaction with another cell exactly like this. So this one concept is going to help you understand a lot of different things. First thing that's going to happen in our typical synapse functioning is this. You've got the action potential coming down. We'll just assume it's because you've smelled roast beef or you've heard a sound or you've seen something that you are going to react to. So the action potential comes down, and as soon as it gets to the terminal button, it causes these little channels, which are embedded proteins within the cell membrane of the neuron, the terminal button part. It causes calcium channels to open up. These are little openings like a subway door or something like that, an elevator door to open up, and calcium, much of which has been pumped out so that it is at higher concentration outside, the calcium now rushes in. When the calcium rushes in, it's going to cause the activation of a bunch of proteins that are inside the terminal button, essentially building a scaffold to the vesicles. The vesicles are the little containers that are packaging lots and lots of molecules of neurotransmitter. So calcium channel opens, calcium rushes in, activates these proteins that pull the vesicles to what we call the presynaptic membrane. This is, the synapse has presynaptic, synaptic cleft, postsynaptic cell. The vesicles fuse. Here you can see a bunch of vesicles. They've dyed the molecules different colors. They are inside of it. When the vesicle fuses its membrane with the presynaptic membrane, it causes the contents of the vesicle to be dumped into the synaptic cleft. So you've just released a huge amount of chemical that is going to have some influence. There's fluid in the synaptic cleft. When the molecules are released, it's floating around. They're going to be moving around randomly within there. Some of the neurotransmitter in this tiny space between the two cells is going to diffuse across to the other side. Well, the postsynaptic cell has receptors, proteins that are embedded within membranes that can bind to a particular molecule if it's exactly shaped properly. They bind to it and they cause a sodium channel to open up. Now, sodium ions can rush in and we initiate an action potential if it's another cell. If we're talking about a muscle, and this is a motor neuron, the neurotransmitter that would be released would be acetylcholine. This is always the neurotransmitter that is released at synapses between a neuron, a motor neuron, and a muscle. So acetylcholine diffusing across, binding to the acetylcholine receptor, I've abbreviated it ACH, binds, causes a channel to open, sodium channel, and it causes a contraction of the muscle. Now, the process isn't over because we got to reset the cell. acetylcholine gets released from the receptor. It's going to just diffuse around until some of it maybe is going to bind to a neurotransmitter receptor for reuptake. So this reuptake receptor grabs onto the acetylcholine, brings it back into the presynaptic cell, packages it again so it can be used. Because we want to make this process as efficient as possible, there also is a chemical within the synaptic cleft that is an enzyme that is breaking down the acetylcholine as fast as it can. It's called acetylcholinesterase. So ASE means it's an enzyme. Acetylcholine, that's what it's breaking down. Therefore, you have two different ways that you are removing acetylcholine from the synapse. One is that reuptake is occurring so that you can recycle it. The other is enzymatic breakdown is occurring so that you can clear it out. You can have nerve gases that are acetylcholinesterase inhibitors. Think about that. So you have a chemical that gets into the synapse, binds to acetylcholinesterase, the enzyme that's going to break down acetylcholine, and inactivates it. What's that going to do? It's going to cause acetylcholine to be in the synapse for longer. And reuptake is still occurring, but a lot of it is going to bump into postsynaptic cells again, bind again, cause an additional contraction. So with an acetylcholinesterase inhibitor, you get this continued firing of muscles, and from that, you can cause death in an animal. So these nerve gases cause it in that way. Or you can have another type of poison, curare. And what curare does is it binds to the acetylcholine receptor on the muscles, but it doesn't cause a contraction. So now you're blocking the receptor and you're not causing contraction, so you get a complete paralysis. So here's our take-home message that at the synapse, you have this action potential, this change in electrical potential of the membrane, converted to a chemical signal, the release of neurotransmitter. These neurotransmitters are released, they diffuse across the synaptic cleft, and they stimulate tissue there, muscle, or another neuron. Seeing a picture of someone yawning can make you tired. It's easy to find pictures of animals as well. We see yawning in all sorts of them. I show these because I want to talk about probably the most commonly used drug. In fact, I'm guessing maybe that you've taken this drug today. What is it? Well, it's a drug that you take because you want to feel less tired and more alert. What is it? Caffeine. Probably the favorite drug of humans across the world. And let me explain how it works. We know quite a bit about caffeine. So typically, the way your brain is functioning, you have neurons firing, you have neurotransmitter release, you have reuptake occurring, you have breakdown, enzymatic breakdown, you have production of enzymes, you have a lot of cellular stuff going on. As a byproduct of all this cellular activity in your brain, there's a buildup of the chemical adenosine. You might remember from high school biology, adenosine triphosphate. So it's the same thing. It's part of ATP. It's part of a lot of things. But this adenosine builds up. You can think of it as like exhaust, that the cells are running hard, they're spewing out adenosine. This molecule can bind to postsynaptic cells. So a lot of cells have adenosine receptors. They also have receptors for acetylcholine or for a whole variety of other neurotransmitters, but they have adenosine receptors. And over the course of a day, there's more and more and more adenosine in the synaptic cleft, in the space between all these cells, and it binds to these receptors. When it binds to the receptor, what it does, it causes ion channels to open up and stay open. What this means is that sodium that you were pumping out previously so that a cell could fire, you could have an action potential, because now there are holes all over the place where it can get back in, you can't maintain a sodium concentration gradient, so the cell is less likely to fire because you've messed with its ability to reset, to be cocked and loaded. You can think of adenosine as like a brake to neuron activity. Over the course of the day, more and more of the postsynaptic membranes have adenosine bound, and so they can't maintain concentration gradients of sodium ions, and activity can't occur. Where does caffeine come in? That just says that over time you get tired. There are lots of reasons why we get tired. This is just one of them. But coffee and other products that have caffeine in them have a certain effect. Now, coffee gets its caffeine from the coffee bean. This is the seed of a flowering plant that we call the coffee bean, but it's the seed of the plant. Here we see some of them growing. The chemical caffeine looks very similar to adenosine. It looks similar enough that it can bind to an adenosine receptor, but it doesn't have the same effect. It's not exactly the same shape. So it binds to the adenosine receptor. It doesn't change it enough so that it opens up the channel so that you can't maintain a concentration gradient. So it doesn't make the neuron less likely to fire, but now it's blocking the spot. So now your adenosine is floating around, but it's not reducing the activity of cell. So previously you get tired because you are super tired and you're sending information to cells like, oh, I want to lift my arm up, or oh, I want to think, but the signal's not getting through because the postsynaptic cells, they don't want to fire. Now you block them with caffeine, and what happens? Adenosine can't slow down your cells. You feel more alert. You feel less tired. You might think that's good, but I have to consume the caffeine first so that I fill up all the receptors with caffeine so adenosine can't bind. No, it doesn't even require that. Caffeine can knock the adenosine out and then sit in its place, keep the channels from becoming open. So it makes you untired. The caffeine pushes the adenosine out, it sits there, it doesn't quiet down that cell. Here's a little graph showing just how much caffeine people consume. It's very bad for kids to have it. As people get older, they consume more and more and more. There might be in a can of soda, Diet Coke, say there are about 45 milligrams of caffeine. So you see here someone in the 18 to 24 range is having about 125 milligrams per day. Here's an interesting thing. Not only does it make us feel alert and less tired, it improves athletic endurance. It improves strength. One result showed this among bike riders when they had consumed a bunch of caffeine about an hour before the bike race. They had almost 20% more endurance. We've also seen this. Learning can be improved with caffeine. Researchers had a bunch of rats that they were looking at how quickly can they learn to run a maze. And when they put caffeine into their water, they were significantly better at learning and remembering the maze. Here's a really interesting study. The military is interested in optimizing performance and in many cases has to worry about situations where people are going to be super tired. Can they function as well as possible? So in this study that was called Visual Vigilance Following Caffeine Consumption compared to placebo treatment at the 73rd hour of Hell Week for U.S. Navy SEAL trainees. So these people who are training to become Navy SEALs, one of the most rigorous training programs anywhere, at one point they have to be up more than 3 days. So they've gone 72 hours is 3 days. They're now in the 73rd hour where they are still awake. So you can imagine all of the adenosine that's been produced over that time. Normally when you sleep, the adenosine gets pulled off the receptors, gets recycled, and you reset. But if you don't sleep, it just keeps building up. What they did was they gave them doses of caffeine. And they had this an hour before training, and they had either 100 milligrams or 200 milligrams or 300 milligrams. And then they looked at how well they did at this visual vigilance test. So these are for people who have guns and they have to detect whether something is a threat or not a threat, and they have to respond appropriately. And what you see in this graph is that with 100 milligrams of caffeine, all of a sudden the number of hits goes up significantly. In other words, they're at 140% of the hits that they had with no caffeine, whereas their reaction time in purple goes down. So they're better at hitting things and they're faster. Also in yellow, we have false alarms where they think that something's a threat and it's not. That also goes way down. You get much better at distinguishing. And whether it's 100 milligrams or 200 milligrams or 300 milligrams, in all cases, the effectiveness at getting hits was significantly higher, reaction time slowed down, and the instance of false alarms also goes down. So they see significant improvement from this. In sports as well, we see a lot of investigation into the functioning of caffeine to improve performance. And in one study of well-trained college rowers, they had them consume about 6 milligrams per kilogram body weight. So this turned out to be about 400 milligrams. This was even more than in the military study. This is more than a lot of people have in a given day. So it's pretty high dosage. But they looked at how quickly can they row 2,000 meters on a rowing machine, and those that got the placebo did it in 6 minutes 56 seconds, whereas those who had the caffeine did it in 6 minutes 50 seconds. To have a 6-second reduction in your time on a 2,000 meter ergo is a really remarkable improvement. This was from a study in men, but we see the same effects in women. It's pretty dramatic. This is why there's a lot of research into this. There are now some regulations on how much caffeine can be consumed by athletes, and there's a lot of interest in it. I should say this, that if you consume a lot of caffeine over a long period of time, your body responds by producing more and more and more adenosine receptors in cells. It has other systems that can detect, shouldn't we be feeling tired now? We've been up for a long time, in other ways. Let's put some more adenosine receptors so we're a little bit better at receiving that signal. That's why over time it can take more and more and more. You build up a tolerance to get the same effect. One of the things that has been learned is that if you completely cut out caffeine, then your body has the opposite response, like, whoa, we're way more tired than we should be given how long we've been up. Little by little, it reduces the number of adenosine receptors in these postsynaptic cells. After about anywhere from 10 to 12 days, you go back down to sort of a baseline level. That's why if you were going to do that ergo, or you were going to do something that required your top performance, if you have cut out the caffeine, go on caffeine watch for 2 weeks, then you consume it, you get a significantly better improvement. Whereas if you're just taking caffeine all the time, your body can respond to it. I told this to one of my friends, Omar, and Omar decided that he was going to cut out caffeine for 2 weeks to see if then when he consumed it, he would have a greater effect. And he sent me this email. I thought this was funny. He said, Jay, I hope you are well. I wanted to let you know firsthand the impact you've had on my life. Seriously, I did a 12-day caffeine purge a few weeks ago. I thought you'd like to know the results from a scientific point of view. Omar says, day 1, I felt like I lost 20 IQ points, did not have the drive to do anything, not even live. Morning felt empty as I did not have my ritual. At work, I was literally useless. My business partner begged me to take coffee. We were having some work issues that required some brainstorming. I was unable to form a sentence. Worse is, I just didn't care. Day 2, about the same. My exercise routine also suffered, just went through the motions. I cannot say that I had massive headaches, but I started drinking tequila in the afternoon as I needed something to stimulate me. Anything. I think I would have done meth if available. Day 4, much better, all under control, but still tired and sluggish. I should show you a picture here that his work partner took of him outside on a balcony where they work, where he just had to lay down and sleep during the day. Okay, day 4 was much better, all under control, but still tired and sluggish. Day 10, waking up in the morning, feeling awesome. Never felt that way in 20 plus years. No moods, energy levels were great. My mind was clear. Never thought I could wake up and be ready to go. I don't remember ever doing that. The only time was high school. Day 12, coming back from work, no coffee, feeling great, putting some music in the car, felt like I was 16, just happy to be alive and pumped. Today, I have 1 coffee in the morning and 1 before a workout. When I take this coffee, I feel like it's a jolt of adrenaline. It is a super performance enhancer. So, conclusion, this really, really, really worked. I used to be tired every 2 hours, not anymore. Now I know I will likely slowly slip into more and more coffees. But the conclusion is that I now know how to feel 20 years younger mentally. Maybe this was more pronounced for me because I used to drink 12 plus coffees per day. I'm not over dramatizing the above. Ask John V. That's his wife. Anyway, thank you. So there you have it, caffeine watch. We'll see if it's really the performance enhancer that it seems to be, but it's very promising because the downsides seem to be relatively minimal. Caffeine, I will say this, if it interferes with sleep, sleep is extremely important. I talked about adenosine receptors building up, telling your body to quiet down and go to sleep, and that when you sleep, the adenosine gets removed so that the cells reset. Lots of other stuff happens. In fact, sleep is probably the most poorly understood biological phenomenon there is. Nonetheless, we know that lots of important stuff happens. If you keep someone from sleeping, you can kill them just from not letting them sleep. So it is important. If people consume caffeine in ways that interferes with sleep, that's really bad. But if it's consumed earlier in the day, it's about as close to a free lunch that I know of in terms of chemicals that cause increased either athletic performance or cognitive functioning. So there you have it.